You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Welcome to this episode of Leading the Factory Forward. This is episode number 86, and it's titled, Are You Ready for Accelerating Change? At Leading the Factory Forward, our goal is to help you create a compelling future for yourself, your teams, and your organization. I encourage you to visit my website and to download the summary at the bottom of each podcast episode and use that as a tool to capture notes as you explore the concepts in this episode. Or to help you get started on your journey and to stay up to date on new episodes, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. Well, today we're going to be talking about an article written by Michael Simmons, who is an author who has gone through and done a summary of all the things about change and accelerating change. Again, just to give us a feel for what we're looking at as leaders, as silver entrepreneurs, as business leaders. A couple of quotes from his article. Futurists from the 20th century predicted that labor-saving devices would make leisure abundant. But rather than inhabiting a world of time wealth, we're inhabiting a world of time poverty. And rather than feeling the luxury of time freedom, we're feeling burdened by constant hurry. So Michael went through and he actually studied the work of 10 different authors who had written either books or significant articles about this whole idea of the acceleration of digital capitalism, the acceleration of time. Things like Ray Kurzweil, who is mentioned in the title of How Time and Change is Advancing. He talks about the singularity is near. In other words, we're on an exponential change path and not a linear one. So again, Michael Simmons spent over 100 hours reading the top 10 books related to this subject, and here he's provided a summary of it. And so the first item he talks about is what he calls the Red Queen effect. And this comes from in the looking glass, but it has to do with we seem to be in a never-ending race. And so rather than saving us time, it just means we have more things that we can do. Or more importantly, more things that our competitors are doing. So it's one of those things in what's called the Red Queen effect. It amounts to we're just running faster to try to stay up with the competitors. So there is no lasting advantage. And standing still is the thing that allows us to fall behind, literally. So it's, again, this whole idea of change and technology and productivity are a double-edged sword because they increase the ease and speed with which we can do something, but it also fuels more competition. Again, it gets into areas of like talent. We can almost be now in a global talent race. So it's one of those things where it just becomes more and more difficult to find talent because everybody's looking for it. I always remember when I was on a school board, presentation, they talked about just this overall idea of talent. And well, both India and China each have 4 times as many people as we do in the U.S. So if you were just to speculate that the top 1/4 of your students are the honor students or the most significant talented students, well, that would mean that each of those 2 countries, they have more honor students than we have total students. You can imagine as we become more of a global village, this idea of competing for talent, everybody has hopes, dreams, and aspirations, no matter where they are in the world. The other thing is this whole idea of with everybody participating in the global marketplace, it's harder to be heard. It's also, just really hard to stand out. So again, it leads us on this never-ending treadmill of how do we get better faster? And conversely, I think something that comes into play here is, again, the ideas of emotional intelligence, the ideas of we can't always be better, faster, cheaper. That may not be sustainable for us. So we have to think about, okay, what is it that we're doing that we need to make some different choices on? There again, then, this difference between technology change and people change. While technology is changing in the blink of an eye, we as individuals or people, we're dealing with some of the same problems. Biology doesn't necessarily change that rapidly. Every day I read a chapter out of a book called The Daily Stoic. And this is from the Stoic philosophers of over 2,000 years ago. And really, they're describing problems with interactions with people and how we live our lives that are virtually the same today, 2,000 years later. And yet, obviously, the technology they were facing at the time is very different than what we have today. So it's one of those things where we have to understand, how we're going to work with technology and address some of these issues. The other thing is this whole idea of we tend to think we're on a linear course. I'll say from my experience, with continuous improvement programs. You can make incremental improvements as you go through time, and that's still a valid thing, but it's one of those things where some of these improvements are actually speeding up. And you can't just no longer work faster. You actually have to be able to think differently about things rather than just saying, I'm going to work a little few extra hours to catch up on this. And 2020, there were so many things packed into 2020 in terms of change. And Michael Simmons points out several of them, a historic pandemic, historical social movements, historic stimulus spending, historic wildfires, historic election, historic stock market highs, and historic technology breakthroughs. They're starting to see some of these quantum computers. We're seeing some AI. So all of a sudden, all this list of things that happened in 2020, we're all going to sit there and say, oh, now the things will slow down. In fact, most people would say that's probably not going to happen. This was it may have been a one-year acceleration, but it's not like it's going to drop back to, quote, normal. So, how do we get our minds around this as much as anything? And we just have to recognize that this is how it's going to work. If my mother, who is 94, she grew up where if you had one phone, it was amazing. And if that phone could help you connect with 2 or 3 people, that was amazing. And even getting electricity in the house was something that came about in her early lifetime. So here we are, and all of a sudden we've got the changes. I'll always remember some years ago when my middle son was born, which was 1986. I went to buy him a book about the space race. I thought, well, this would be interesting. This happened before he was born. But as I looked through that book, I couldn't believe how rudimentary, how crude the technology was that we used to send people to the moon. You look at pictures of the spacecraft, and they talked about how they did calculations and still were using paper, those kinds of things. Amazing, how it's changed. When I first started work, I worked in big rooms of engineers like myself, and we wrote things literally on paper. And if we had to recopy it, we did it again on paper. We looked like a group of scribes from the Middle Ages with all these people working on paper. Of course, now that's all gone. It's all done online. Sometimes it's done through video or audio. But again, this whole idea of looking forward, if we thinking of ourselves on exponential growth, that means things are going to come faster, and we have to get used to how are we going to handle that. It's no longer, I think things are a little different. It's, I don't even understand what these things are. And that's right now, I would say, the arena of AI. I know it. I have an awareness of it, but I can't say I have a real firm grasp of how AI works and how it's going to impact me, other than that I know it's going to. It's going to be interesting. And we have to accept the fact that it's going to be surprising. We're used to projecting out for a year or a 5-year plan where things 5 years out will be different than today, but they'll still be pretty recognizable. We're at a spot now where that may not exactly be true. In fact, as Ray Kurzweil, the head of Google engineering, says, the future will be far more surprising than most of us realize. And it's, again, we tend to think in incremental change when, in fact, he would suggest we're experiencing exponential change. The other thing Ray says is he talks about the 10-year rule. And he says we're basically doubling the paradigm shift rate every decade. So that means, again, what we experienced this year in 2020, in 2030, will only take 6 months to see the changes we saw in 2020. And in 2040, we'll see the amount of change we saw in 2020 in only 3 months. So again, this is the idea of how do we become aware faster? How do we look at things more quickly? The next thing he kind of talks about is how to prepare for this. What are we going to do when the world we're going to look at a year or 2 or 3 from now is going to be significantly different from what we're seeing today? Some of this is, are we going to be in a race against people and machines? Are we going to try to outwork other people? And that probably isn't possible because, here again, these paradigm shifts will be competing in a whole different way than we're competing today. In fact, I just saw a thing not long ago that during the last year, 75% of consumers changed their buying patterns. So think of it as a company. We're used to people buying in a certain way. We compete with people that are all used to having people buy a certain way. And all of a sudden now, in 12 months, 75% of people have changed their buying patterns. So it's a race, how do we adjust to new habits, new ways of thinking, new paradigms and what we're going to do? And then we got, the race against the machines, the whole idea of AI is going to eliminate our jobs. And some of that is going to be true. On the other hand, there will be new jobs. And we can think of jobs that if you go on LinkedIn now or something and look for job listings, if you really thought about it and look back 10 years, many of those job listings didn't even exist at the time. So again, futurists say we're not going to race against the machines, but we have to learn to race with them. So for example, in my case, I know I have to get better at understanding analytics. I need to have to get better to see what AI affect me. So I'm a coach and consultant. How will AI impact the coaching business? It will. And I can't say I have a good handle on it now, but it will have a certain impact on it moving forward. And then finally, we just have to remember, because of the whole digital work, we truly are going to be at a global village. So we're not going to be competing against the people in our local neighborhood. We're not going to be competing against the people even in our state or even our nation. We're going to be competing against people throughout the world. Now, I've seen marvelous examples of small manufacturers in our local area that are indeed selling their products throughout the world. And that's going to be true of everybody. So competition will be different. And you think of this pandemic, all of a sudden we had to work remotely. We had to, in some cases, get entertainment remotely, even get our groceries remotely. Okay, so what will that mean when, as a global economy, we're all in this together, as it were? Another thing is time is going to erase advantages, and that happens even in today's world. But you think of the Fortune 500 companies, the lifespan of those companies was like 90 years in 1935. The lifespan of those companies in 1958 was about 60 years. And now in 2010, 10 years ago, the lifespan of those companies is about 14 years. So again, that means there's great opportunity and great disruption probably on our horizon. So we have to just be considering that. So again, Michael Simmons says, what can we do about this in terms of our careers and stuff? You need to not only accept new ideas, but you're going to have to reinvent yourself. And how I would phrase that is you have to be ready to adapt new mindsets. So I'm a boomer. I've adapted how to technology. I've always had an affinity for technology, but I think all of us are just going to have to, again, be ready to change our mindsets, especially around technology, and change our mindsets about what's the work that we're going to do where people will find value. And I would suggest to you that a lot of it is going to be, we're going to have to handle people-to-people interactions a lot more than maybe technology interactions. So it's one of those things that, again, we have to be mindful of what's going on. We don't have to chase everything. I don't have to go to learn TikTok and Clubhouse right away, but I have to have a general awareness of how am I going to provide value moving forward. Here's the thing where Michael Simmons suggests that the ability to learn is going to be the key thing moving forward. So again, as we've many times have said, what you learn through your schooling, your formal education, only gets you so far, and in fact may only get you about 5 years into your career. We are going to be relearning things every 5 to 10 years throughout our career. I had to do that, and it's only going to get shorter. So a key skill that you'll have to have, and I'll have to have, is how to learn and relearn, forgetting and then learning something new to adopt a new paradigm. The final thing that Michael Simmons shares is what he calls the 5-hour rule, which he says is the antidote to exploding pace of modern life. And he says you really need to devote an hour of every weekday to learning. And a lot of the very successful people do that. So they take roughly 10% of their time away from execution to be intentionally learning, because learning is also something that can compound as you go along. So that after, 50 weeks of learning 5 hours a week, you've done a significant amount of education for yourself. Well, that's kind of what's going to be required moving forward in the future years, because quite frankly, working harder isn't sustainable. And you really have to make that investment in your learning of at least an hour a day or 5 hours a week to help you even stay even, but maybe be relevant and be satisfied and thrive in a new economy. So it's one of those things. And then I think in general, you'll have to learn to make choices. We can easily be overwhelmed with all the data. I mean, as you think about it just biologically, if our brain didn't sort things out, just the amount of raw inputs coming into our 5 senses would overwhelm us. So our mind automatically sorts things out. But with technology, again, our mind changes slowly. So our facility to automatically sort this out is not as good as maybe it needs to be. We have to be consciously willing to sort out what we're going to allow into our lives and what we're going to provide our actions on. So that's the main ideas for this article. I really recommend you read the article because it's very, I'll say disturbing, but it's very thought-provoking at the very least. And again, just to recap, this is difficult. Change is difficult. It's complex. It's not going away. 6 main ideas that Michael proposes in there: that time is accelerating because of this Red Queen effect, there's going to be an acceleration shock that we all experience. This idea of the 10-year rule, that we shrink our paradigms by a factor of 1 or 2 every 10 years. In other words, the paradigm shift that you may have experienced in 10 years, you'll now experience it in 5 or even 3 months. How to prepare yourself for this coming acceleration shock. What can we do about this acceleration in our careers? How can we still maintain our contributions in society even when we're facing all this accelerated change? And then finally, he tells us in terms of how we can address this issue, at least in the right now, is the 5-hour rule. It's sort of an antidote to the exploding pace of modern life. So we have to focus on learning, and we have to place our attention on learning in at least 10% or more of our time. So that concludes this episode, and I thank you for listening. As to what's up next, it'll continue to be a mix of episodes. I think in the next few episodes, I'm going to have a lot of interviews with people who have launched careers on their own, and they might provide services to others, like silver entrepreneurs who might need some help as they become a company of one. And as always, I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode as you start exploring these ideas. And to help you get started on the journey and to stay up to date, please download the free worksheet, 3 Steps You Need for a More Productive Workday. Thanks for listening, and there'll be a link to this article that you can look at in your own time in the notes. So again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.